The grand hall opened like the mouth of a sleeping beast, flanked by stone columns carved with running wolves, their eyes set with pieces of amber that caught the torchlight and seemed to breathe. Music moved like a low tide beneath the vaulted ceiling, strings drawn slow and dark, and the scent of cedar and rain threaded through everything. At the far end, Dominic waited. Even seated, he commanded the room the way a cliff commands the ocean, unyielding, inevitable. His crown was simple iron layered with silver, made heavier by the weight of eyes and expectation. The banners above him stirred in a current that didn't touch my skin, as if the hall itself exhaled around him. I could feel people watching me without looking up. Every step I took pressed a memory into stone. My mother's pendant warmed against my skin, as if something inside the crescent had woken the moment the doors opened. A hush rippled outward, and in that hush my heartbeat sounded too loud, too mortal. For a place like this, I reached the dais and stopped. Dominic's gaze climbed from the hem of my gown to my face with a patience that frayed my composure. Up close, the scars at his throat looked like rivers cut into rock. Power sat in him like a coiled storm. The chair was only wood and wheels. The man upon it was a kingdom. Vows in Ravenwood are not spoken to a priest or a book. They are offered to the living memory of the pack, to those who came before and those who may come after. The officiant's voice rose, gravel and smoke, older than the hall, older than me. A litany about moonright and mindright, about guardianship and the price of being chosen. When he asked if I would bind, a tremor crawled up my spine. When he asked if Dominic would claim, the air changed. Something unseen leaned closer. Curious. He lifted my hand. His touch carried winter and wild pine. The ring slid over my finger, metal cool as a night river, and suddenly the strings ceased. Silence gathered itself into a living thing. Somewhere high, a wind moved through stone. A single Wolf carved above the arch seemed to lean forward with us. They placed a silver bowl between us, liquid inside, black as a new moon. A ritual of the old ways, a drop of blood to wake the vow. I did not flinch when they pricked my thumb. I did not flinch when his thumb joined mine, our hands suspended over the surface. 2 drops fell, flowered and braided into one dark thread that refused to separate. The officiant exhaled like a man who had braced for thunder and heard it pass. A sound rose. Not applause, not cheer. Something deep and wordless from the assembled throats. A hum that found the hollow in my chest and filled it until my knees went soft. The scent of the room changed, heavy with heat and cedar and a faint electric bite ozone before a storm. The moment passed, leaving a hush that felt scraped clean. He bent his head, and the crown tilted toward me. His mouth was close enough that breath ghosted my cheek. His voice moved low, private, threaded through the crowd's distance. Whatever he said dissolved into the warmth ribboning through my skull. I only know that when he let my hand go, something invisible remained knotted there, a weight and a tether. They called me queen. The word rang like a struck bowl, pure and impossible. I had walked from rain and lily into iron and vows and come away branded by a sound. The feast was a procession of heat and jewels on plates. I tasted nothing. I learned the shapes of the counselor's eyes, who watched me to weigh me, who watched the king to taste his weather. Laughter rose and fell in practiced arcs. Somewhere a dance's bells chimed like frost. Dominic did not touch the goblet they kept refilling at his elbow. He watched, measured, listened. The Wolf in him pressed hard against the bones of restraint. I learned the way his jaw tightened when someone lied. I learned the way his fingers stilled when he listened inward, to a thing only he could hear. Once the hall shifted around us, and I realized he had moved his chair a fraction closer without a sound, bringing his shoulder into the margin of my sight. A guard near the doors had gone very still. A man's posture at the edge of the crowd had changed from soft to knife. The moment dissolved as quickly as it formed, leaving only the impression of silent teeth around something fragile. Stories moved across the tables like lanterns on water. What the Blackwood clans had done to raiding lines. What neighboring courts offered with palms that hid the nails. What the moon had taken from him and what he had taken in return. In every telling, two truths were always there. He had not shifted since the blade, and he ruled anyway. Power had changed shape. Power had not left him. When the interruption came, it tore cleanly through the practice of celebration. Boots, voices, a body dragged into light. The boy's words spilled like gravel, raw and desperate. Smoke, children, north, payment for your sins. Gasps, and the metallic shiver of fear tightened the air. Dominic did not startle. He simply arrived at decision like a hawk arriving at a branch. All wings pulled in. Balance absolute. The commands he gave remade the room. Protocol fell away and left only purpose. People moved. Maps appeared. Runners ran. The feast curdled into strategy. When he turned to me, the noise dimmed without anyone quieting. He told me I would not be joining him. He told me there was a key and a letter and a door behind a tapestry. And that trust in this place was a currency counterfeiters had learned to forge too well. He spoke the names of the ones whose smiles had edges. He said the wound that took his legs had not taken his hands from the reins. The way he looked at me then was not through me, but into me, like a man looking down a well to hear if water still lived there. I did not look away. I belonged to this moment whether I wanted it or not. Morning peeled itself from the night with the sound of armor. Of hooves like a storm made of iron. From the tower window the courtyard looked like a living thing. A dark lung expanding with horses, contracting with formation. Exhaling orders that turned into movement. They strapped his legs into the saddle with leather that gleamed like oiled bark. He took the reins. The stallion under him was black enough to swallow light and impatient enough to argue with the morning. When he tipped his head, very slightly, the gesture landed where I stood. I raised my hand and did not know if I was blessing him or pleading with the sky. The horn sounded. The gate swallowed them, then spat only dust and a thin echo of hooves. The palace, relieved of its king, showed its bones. Without his gravity the corridors felt longer, the corners darker. Lady Helena brought what he left for me. The keys were heavy in the palm, cold in a way that belonged to metal, but hinted at consequence. The seal on the letter cracked like ice beneath a heel. Words angled across the page with a hand that refused to soften for anyone. There are studies that are only rooms until the right key enters them. The tapestry mouth opened on a sigh. The smell of paper and wax and oil lived inside. And something else lived too. Intention left behind by a man who had to learn patience. The way a river learns rock by constant meeting. Maps with pins in the places that mattered. Books with their spines worn where fingers had taught them to open. A desk whose surface looked like it had a memory for every scrape. The journals were dense with a mind, refusing to be conquered by pain. Rage had left its grooves in the early pages, lines cut too deep, being stabbed through to the wood beneath. But then calculation arrived, and with it the slow architecture of revenge. Names, dates, glances someone thought were private, coin that moved like a disease through the veins of a city. A web with no center visible until you stepped back and saw it was drawn around the throne. The last pages reached a hand into my chest. My father's name written not as rumor, but as a hinge. What if the man I had mourned had worked with the king, not against him? What if he had died because he chose not to turn the key someone else pressed into his palm? What if my stepmother had built an altar to ambition on the wrong grave? I felt the shape of my life change without noise. It was like walking the same hall you always did and finding a new door in the wall where none had ever been. When the letter had burned, it left a curl of smoke that smelled. Journals back to sleep and went to learn what men with rings and ancient titles wanted to do. To a girl who had been a queen for less than a day, the council chamber was a circle designed to make everyone visible and no one safe. I took the chair that wore the crest, and every muscle in the room pretended not to react. We discussed grain like it was war and war like it was weather. Their words braided themselves into ropes, and I began to see which ropes were meant to pull and which were meant to strangle. I learned who smiled with their eyes and who smiled with their knives. They tested me with sugar and with stone. They pressed using my family's name like a thumb on a bruise. I gave them answers that tasted like honey while I built a wall behind my teeth. When they rose, they did so with expressions that said either I had surprised them, or they were certain they could afford to pretend I had. After, the chancellor stayed. Ink had found a home in his skin. He handed me a message that spoke in riddle and moon. The wolf hunts the hunter at moonrise. The words felt like a stone falling through water, vanishing, leaving only rings that kept traveling. A trap waited for my husband, and I was learning how to be a language that could make people move. Lady Helena came at dusk, and the room felt smaller because there were truths in it that hadn't been said aloud yet. When she told me what my father had been to this crown, the world tilted and held. The pendant in my hand turned from memory into a key I couldn't see the lock for. She weighed me with her eyes and found either copper or gold. I couldn't tell which. She said training had already happened to me in games I hadn't known were training. She said the wall my father built might still be there if I felt along it in the right place. After she left, the chamber had the hush of a church after the last candle is pinched out. I took the pendant in both hands and pressed until its edges bit my skin. Something gave a click like a distant door latch, and a triangle of paper slid into my palm light as a moth. The letters on it were the bones of a place. Numbers like stars. Words like roots. Hollowed oak. Third shelf. Red spine. I moved before fear could talk me out of it. The chancellor brought a map, and I pinned time to distance with my finger. Forest. Border of our old lands. A building that wasn't ruined so much as a man's excuse to be alone. I remembered the smell of damp leaves and the way my father's boots had never sounded there. I remembered him saying thinking like other men required, silence like other men feared. We left as the city's lamps began to blink into life. The servants' gate swallowed us, and the alleys became a map only the mice knew. Roads turned to ruts, ruts turned to grass, and the grass became the forest's breath, moist and layered with green. Night moved with us, sparrows of starlight scattered in the black. I rode as if I had been doing it all my life and only now remembered. Dawn lifted one gray lid over the clearing. The stone library hugged the earth as if it had grown there instead of been built. Ivy braided itself up the walls like long hair left to the weather. Inside, dust lay where time had put it, except where a human hand had made a path. The hollow was where the note said it would be. The book was where the hollow said it would be. The key knew what it had been born to open. The folio breathed when the cords came loose. Names and roots. Safe houses like beads on a thread pulled through the land. A list of debts that were really loyalties and loyalties that were really debts. And on a separate sheet, the places nearest the northern passes where a man fleeing death could become a shadow long enough to survive it. The warning that riders approached broke the spell with the same finality as glass meeting stone. We split like water around a rock. I sent the chancellor north with the only thing that mattered and kept for myself, the thing that could bring a different kind of dawn to a different kind of room. Men with the wrong banner ate our dust until they didn't. We threw them a false road to follow, and then a narrower truth to choke on. The forest tightened around me like a throat. Branches raked my cloak and let it go. When I reached the waterfall my father had given me from his childhood, time became a loop that knew how to save me. Cloak on the branch. Horse slapped to speed. A fissure behind the falling sheet of water that looked like a trick of light, until you put your body into it and felt the cold lay hands on you. The cave held the damp like a promise. My breath came back to me off the stone walls and sounded like someone else's ghost leading me forward. The boat was where he'd said it would be, with our crest carved small enough to keep a secret and sharp enough to cut a finger if you loved it too hard. I let the stream take me. Sometimes you move yourself through the world. Sometimes the world moves you because you're finally quiet enough to float. The tunnel's black coughed me into a blue that made my eyes water. Vines made a curtain of green lace. Beyond it, the meadow held the day like a held breath. Smoke made thread in the sky above a village. I knew the way you know the taste of your own name. Old men and middle women remember. The way a soldier remembers the fastest way to lift a blade without thinking. They led me not by roads but by absence, places that were not watched, moments when a gate turned its face away. In their kitchen I ate for the first time since vows. And the bread tasted like roofs due to birds, like safety built of small, stubborn decisions. A message was written. A rider was found, young and narrow as an arrow shaft, with eyes that knew how to measure distance with a glance. I gave him the words and the silver crescent and felt the hollow at my throat as if a tooth had been pulled. He left like a promise thrown hard enough to make it to the other side. Returning to the palace required learning. The grammar of smuggling hay in my hair. Cloth creasing my skin in the dark of a wagon. The patience to become cargo until it was safe to be a person again. Stone rose from the fields like a hand's knuckles punching through the earth. Lady Helena's face found me where the light was thin. Duty found me where the hour was almost. Inside, bad spoiled the journey from my bones. And silk learned the shape of a body it would need to convince a room to listen. Midnight blue made my skin paler and my eyes stronger. I tucked proof where fabric pretends to be harmless. And I walked into the council chamber with the kind of quiet that makes men count the exits. They had gathered under the emergency he had called, but not for the reason he claimed. Smiles laid themselves like placemats. Concern was arranged as if on a mantle. When I spoke, I chose the parts of the truth that cut the cleanest. When he answered, he chose the parts of his lie that sounded like care. The table between us became a field with mines I had planted without moving. When I put the papers down, the room inhaled too sharply. A chorus of throats forgetting their cues. He reached toward the dagger that saw itself as solution. My hand found his wrist the way the river finds the shore, inevitable, unhurried, unyielding. The guards did the rest, yanking the mask off the wolf that couldn't manage to be anything but hungry in the end. Silence poured into the space. His protests had been scraping. Then the doors opened without sound, and the storm I'd sent for 40 miles through forest and rumor came back to me wearing leather and dust and my pendant. Dominic's eyes were no longer winter. They were the edge of summer heat that warns of thunder if you stand still and listen. He moved his chair beside mine and placed his hand in a way the room would not notice, but I could not ignore. Warm, heavy, ownership given and taken in a single gesture that felt like neither prison nor chain, only weight I had chosen to bear. He spoke to the room in a voice that knew where to find bone. He named what had been done to him and by whom, not as a performance but as a ledger someone had finally balanced. When the traitor was dragged out, he turned to the ones whose ambition had worn better clothes and removed their chairs from under them, without raising his voice. When we were alone, the palace remembered how to breathe. The air slipped around pillars like cloth. He turned to face me as if the world were obliging enough to hold its questions a few seconds longer. I had saved his life with motion and with stillness and with the courage to put my hand where a knife was reaching. He had given me keys and risk and a country's attention, and I had not broken under any of it. He placed the silver crescent back around my throat, and the metal remembered me. The click at the clasp sounded strangely like a door opening somewhere I couldn't see. The weight settled at my collarbone. We sat there with the future between us, like a creature that had wandered in from the dark and lain down to sleep by the fire. Outside, the city recalibrated itself around fresh orders, rumor uncoiling down streets like spilled ribbon. Somewhere above, the moon dragged itself thin across the black. And for a heartbeat, my skin felt too tight, as if a howl had been born in my chest and was listening for its own echo. When sleep found me, it came like the hush after a story ends and before another begins. I dreamed of my mother walking through a forest whose trees wore iron crowns. She pinned the crescent at my throat with fingers calloused by work and by love. When I woke, the mark her touch left was only warmth and a thread of courage I could pull on when the day demanded it. Morning was not gentle. Morning rarely is for queens. But I rose with a spine that knew itself. In the mirror, the girl who had been sold looked back at me and was already becoming someone the sellers would not recognize. The palace learned the rhythm of my steps. The council learned the patience of my silences. And somewhere far north under a sky the color of uncut steel, the man who had not shifted in 4 years rode back toward me with a packless gravity that did not need claws to command. The story had shifted. The king was not the only one learning how to be more than his wound. By dusk, I could feel the kingdom in the pads of my fingers, the roughness of its borders, the slickness where the coin still bled, the soft places where children slept and had to be protected with laws as much as with swords. I learned the names of servants who moved unnoticed and the stories of kitchens where power changes flavor before it changes hands. I filed them away the way my father had taught me, with games that had never been games. The network answered my tug on its threads with small, precise gifts, a ledger copied in a hand that would not be missed, a timetable for a guard rotation altered by a cough, a meeting overheard because someone decided to mend a tapestry near a door. That night, when I crossed the threshold into the chamber where vows had woken something older than language, the fire was already lit, the chair was there. The man in it smelled like pine and leather and distance, and the space between us was no longer a battlefield. It was only a room and 2 people who had started as strangers and burned that scaffolding down to build something else. He looked at me as if I were a map he had traveled without knowing and only now recognized. I looked at him as if the legend beneath that map had changed the shape of the land. The moon climbed, thin and implacable. Wolves carved in stone kept their counsel. Somewhere in the marrow of the rock under us, the old world turned in its sleep and smiled with too many teeth. I laid my hand over the pendant and felt the slow, steady drum of my pulse beneath it. Unbreakable, my mother had said. I believed her. The moon had waned to a thin silver scar in the sky, and the palace slept beneath it. But sleep did not come for me. I walked the length of the balcony until the cold marble numbed the solace of my feet. Below, the forest stretched like a black ocean, whispering secrets only wolves could hear. Somewhere beyond that darkness, Dominic rode through rain and blood. Inside these walls, silence was not peace. It was plotting. The torches flickered too sharply, and servants' footsteps paused too long outside my chamber. I felt it in my bones. Danger no longer came from beyond the gates. It had roots here, in polished floors and honeyed voices. At dawn, the council summoned me. The room was filled with gold, but it gleamed like poison. Lord Malric sat at the head, his ruby ring catching the light like an open wound. The men spoke of borders, alliances, trade routes that hid daggers. When they finally turned their gaze on me, I saw it there. The plan to carve a kingdom without its king. They called it succession, precaution, continuity. I called it treason. I let them talk. I memorized the rhythm of their lies. When I returned to my chambers, the raven was waiting, black feathers, gold eyes, the scent of cedar on its wings. No letter this time, only a scrap of cloth torn from the Alpha's banner, burned at the edges. My heart stumbled. He was alive, or someone wanted me to think so. Night fell heavy. I dismissed the maids and locked the doors. In the quiet, I opened the hidden drawer beneath the writing desk. The key Dominic had given me still lay there, cold and secret. Behind the tapestry of the first queen, a woman whose eyes followed you when you moved, there was a small door, nearly invisible. The lock yielded with a single turn. The chamber beyond was smaller than I expected, lined with shelves and old scrolls that smelled of smoke and iron. In the center, a table. Upon it, maps, some I recognized, some older than the kingdom itself, and a book bound in dark leather, unmarked, waiting. The first page carried a symbol I had seen once before on the back of Dominic's hand when firelight caught his scars. The mark of the moon bonded. The words were not history. They were prophecy. Asterisk, when the Alpha's blood is bound to mortal bone, the curse of the Wolf shall be broken. But should that bond be betrayed, the moon will turn her face and all will burn. Asterisk, I closed the book, and the candle trembled. Somewhere deep within the palace, a howl rose low, distant and impossibly mournful. It did not sound human. I ran to the window. The courtyard below was filled with movement, guards shouting, horses restless. The moonlight painted every blade silver. And then I saw him. Not Dominic, but a rider cloaked in black, carrying a banner I knew too well. The crescent Wolf split in half. The rebellion had come home. By morning, the palace would burn. And I, the mortal queen of a cursed Alpha, would have to decide whether to flee or to fight beside the ghost of a man. The world had already buried Dote. Understood Dote. The night after Dominic's departure stretched endlessly. The palace, once filled with music and movement, had fallen into a silence so heavy it felt alive. Every candle flickered like it feared the dark. Every corridor carried the echo of footsteps that weren't there. I couldn't sleep. The sheets felt too soft, too foreign, and the space beside me, empty, cold, mocked me with its honesty. For the first time since my marriage, I missed the presence of the man who had both terrified and protected me. Outside, the wind pressed against the tall glass windows, whispering like a warning. I stood by the window, fingers pressed to the cool pane, and watched the torches burning along the palace walls. They looked fragile against the vast night, small flames guarding a kingdom that could crumble with one secret. Dominic's last words haunted me. Asterisk, trust no one. Not your family. Not the council. Not even Helena. Asterisk, but trust, I was learning, isn't a choice. It's a habit, one carved deep into the bones of people who have always been alone. And I was very good at being alone. By morning, the first letters arrived. Reports from the border, brought by riders whose faces were pale with exhaustion. I wasn't allowed to open them until the council met, but I didn't need to. I already knew. War had reached the edges of Ravenwood. When I entered the council chamber later that day, eyes followed me like shadows. Lady Blackthorn's lips were curved in the faintest smile. Lord Harrington pretended concern. They thought I couldn't read them. They were wrong. The meeting dragged on. Numbers, losses, supply routes, words that felt hollow in a room full of liars. The sound of my own voice startled me when I spoke. It was steadier than I expected. We will hold the line, I said, even though the words meant little. Until the king returns. The sentence silenced them. Until the king returns. I saw it in their eyes. The question they wanted to ask. When the council finally dismissed, I returned to my chambers, the echo of their whispers clinging to my heels. I locked the door, lit a single candle, and opened the letter Dominic had left for me, the one I hadn't had the courage to finish before. His handwriting was harsh, slanted, and alive. It carried his scent somehow. Smoke, iron, pine. He wrote of strategy, of trust, of danger. But between the lines there was something else. The same quiet pain that lived behind his eyes when he said my name. That unspoken thing between us. Fragile, unfinished. By the third day, the air inside the palace began to change. Servants avoided my gaze. The guards spoke in hushed tones. Doors closed faster than they opened. The calm was too careful, too rehearsed. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. At night, I walked the halls alone. I told myself it was to clear my thoughts, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't bear to sit still. Movement kept the fear from settling. Each step echoed like a heartbeat. I passed portraits of kings long dead, men who ruled with iron and silence. None of them looked kind. None of them looked like Dominic. In the library, the fire had gone out. The air smelled of cold ashes. I stood before the shelves where his journals once lay, thinking of his words, the lines he'd written about his own confinement, his pain. I understood him more now. The loneliness of command, the weight of being feared and needed in the same breath. When I closed my eyes, I could almost feel him there, the way his presence filled a room before he spoke. The quiet authority, the storm under his skin. I wondered if he could still feel me too. Across the miles and the war. Sleep became something I remembered rather than experienced. Each night the dreams returned, not of the attack or the council, but of him. The first time I'd met him in that dark chamber, the firelight on his face, the gold in his eyes that wasn't entirely human. There was always something in him that couldn't be contained. On the seventh night, the wind changed. It carried with it the scent of rain and smoke, and something else. Something sharp, metallic, almost like blood. That was when I knew he was near death. I don't know how I knew. Perhaps the bond that tied us, forged not by choice but by fate, had begun to awaken in me. I felt a pain deep in my chest, a hollow tearing that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't fear. It was absence. That night, I went to the tower balcony where I had last seen him ride away. The moon hung low, thin and pale. I whispered his name into the wind, and felt it carry me away with it. The following morning, a messenger arrived, but not one of Dominic's. His colors were wrong. His words were wrong. And when he bowed too deeply, I saw the glint of a hidden blade under his cloak. The letter he carried bore the royal seal, but it was broken, resealed again with clumsy wax. I took it anyway, hiding my trembling hands behind the folds of my dress. Inside, the message was brief. Asterisk. The king is dead. The council shall assume control. Remain confined until further notice. Asterisk. No signature. No mark of Dominic's hand. My heart didn't believe it, but my body reacted as if it were truth. I felt my knees weaken, the world tilt, the air vanish from my lungs. I forced myself not to fall. Not here. Not in front of him. I burned the letter in the candle flame before he could see. The smoke rose in thin, twisting threads, disappearing just like him. That evening, the palace erupted in celebration. Not public, not loud, but quiet, poisonous. The council gathered for dinner, toasting to stability, to transition. I could hear their laughter through the doors. It made my blood run cold. I didn't go to them. Instead, I sat in the darkness of my chambers and replayed his last words. Trust no one. If he were dead, I would feel it. That was the only thought keeping me alive. The next days blurred into one long hour. The guards at my door changed. Unfamiliar faces, colder eyes. Helena didn't come. The servants who once smiled now looked away. One night, I found a trail of wax across the floor, faint but fresh. Someone had entered my study. Someone had searched Dot in the drawer where I kept his final letter. The parchment was gone. Only the pendant lay there, glowing faintly in the dim light. The crescent moon, his mark, my tether. I wore it again that night. And for the first time, it was warm against my skin. By the 10th day, whispers began spreading through the palace halls. They spoke of unrest in the capital, of soldiers deserting, of fire near the western wall. But beneath all that noise, there was one name that moved through the air like a ghost: Dominic. Some said he lived. Some said his men had seen him walking through smoke, unscathed. Others said they saw a beast at the northern border, a creature that roared like thunder, that tore through enemy lines and vanished into fog. I didn't believe the stories, but I didn't dismiss them either. Because hope is a dangerous thing. It can feed you or consume you. That night, as I stood by the window once again, I heard it, faint but real, the sound of hooves. Distant, rhythmic, unyielding. My heart recognized it before my mind did. The wind pushed through the curtains, carrying with it the smell of pine, steel, and something else, him. But the sound faded, leaving only silence. Hours passed. I stood there until dawn. And when the first light touched the horizon, I saw it, smoke rising beyond the walls. The rebellion had reached the gates. The palace guards scrambled. Bells rang. The sky bled red and gray. I didn't hide. I walked to the throne hall, every step deliberate. If this was my kingdom now, I would not abandon it. The council met me halfway, faces pale, voices trembling. They demanded I sign a decree handing them full control. They called it safety. I called it surrender. When I refused, Lord Malric smiled with the quiet arrogance of a man who had already betrayed everyone. Then your reign ends tonight, he said. The doors behind him burst open, not from soldiers but from wind and rain. The candles went out one by one, as the storm outside broke through the windows. And then I heard it again. The hooves. The roar of horses. The crack of thunder that wasn't thunder. The great doors at the end of the hall swung wide. And through them came light, not sunlight, but the glow of fire behind armor soaked in rain. Dominic. He looked nothing like the man I had seen right away. His face was streaked with mud and blood, his eyes darker than I remembered. Not gold now, but amber burning low. The weight of command, the burden of pain. It was all there, carved into every movement. He didn't look like a king returning from. The council froze. The traitors tried to speak, to explain, to beg. He said nothing. His silence was the sharpest blade in the room. He walked toward me, slow, measured, every step echoing. The wet marble glistened beneath his boots. He stopped before me, close enough that I could see the reflection of the flames in his eyes, and then he breathed. Just that, a long, shuddering breath that carried the weight of survival. He wasn't dead. He had never been dead. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt. He reached out, his hand trembling, not from weakness but restraint. His fingertips brushed the pendant at my throat, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The noise, the rebellion, the fear gone. There was only us. No words were spoken. They weren't needed. Everything was said in that silence. Behind him, his soldiers flooded the hall, seizing the traitors. The rebellion that had grown in shadows died in that light. But I barely saw it. My entire world had narrowed to the space between his hand and my heart. Later that night, after the fires were extinguished and the halls cleaned of blood and ash, I found him alone in the courtyard. The storm had passed. The air was wet and raw, and he stood without his armor staring at the empty sky. I walked to him quietly. The ground still smelled of rain and iron. He didn't turn until I was beside him. He looked exhausted, older somehow, but his eyes, they had changed. There was no bitterness now. No distance. Only the quiet understanding of someone who had almost lost everything. He lifted a hand to my face. The touch was light, reverent. I leaned into it, closing my eyes. For the first time, I felt what I hadn't dared name before. The pull that wasn't duty, wasn't fear, wasn't alliance. It was something deeper, like gravity, ancient and unbreakable. He didn't speak, but I felt it. The promise. The apology. The truth. And when he finally did move, it wasn't toward power or the throne or the crown. It was toward me. The night was still when he kissed me. No music, no witnesses. Just rainwater and breath and 1,000 unsaid things between us. In that moment, everything made sense. The wars, the pain, the loneliness. It had all led here, to the one place where both of us could stop running. When we finally parted, the air felt lighter, like the storm had taken our grief with it. He whispered only once, so quietly that the wind nearly stole it. You were the reason I came back. I didn't answer. I just rested my forehead against his and let the silence finish the sentence for both of us. The palace would heal. The kingdom would rebuild. But in that stillness, beneath a bruised sky and the scent of pine, I understood something no crown could ever teach. That power was never what made him king. It was his will to return. And what made me queen was the courage to wait for him. The days that followed were quieter, but not peaceful. Quiet can be deceiving. It hides the echo of everything that was broken. The rebellion had ended. Yet the scent of smoke lingered in every corridor, clinging to the curtains and tapestries, to our hair, to the spaces between our breaths. The kingdom was alive, but fragile. And so were we. The healers filled the palace, tending to wounds of men who would never fight again. Horses limped through the courtyards, their eyes wild from the noise that had lived too long. Children who had been sent to the southern village began returning. Their laughter thin, uncertain. It felt like the aftermath of a storm that had torn the sky open and left us all staring into it, wondering what it meant to still be here. Dominic spent most of his days in the council chambers, surrounded by maps, reports, and faces that used to be enemies and were now allies out of necessity. I watched him from a distance sometimes. The way a person watches a flame, knowing it can warm you, but also burn you if you get too close. He carried the burden of leadership the way he carried his scars, quietly, without complaint. Yet there were moments when I saw the shadow return to his eyes, the part of him that the war had not taken but had twisted instead. At night, I would find him alone in the garden, where the moonlight caught the lines of his face and softened them. He never noticed me at first. And I would stand at the edge of the path, watching the way he traced his fingers over the leaves, as if feeling for something lost. When he did see me, he would offer that small, tired smile of his, the kind that never quite reached his eyes but still felt like home. Neither of us spoke much then. Words felt too fragile. The bond between us had changed after the battle. It wasn't made of fire anymore, but of quiet recognition, the understanding of two people who had seen the same darkness and survived it differently. He had once been a storm, and I had been the still water trying not to drown. Now somehow, we were learning to be the same sea. But peace is never permanent in kingdoms like ours. Power has a way of creating its own hunger. It began with small things, reports of missing messengers, caravans delayed, letters that never reached their destinations. Then came the whispers, of nobles in the West gathering privately, of coin changing hands, of men drinking to the idea of a future without a wolf-blooded king. Dominic tried to dismiss it as politics, the kind that had always plagued the throne. But I saw the unease in him, the way his hand would tighten on his cane, the way his shoulders would stiffen when anyone spoke of loyalty. The council began to change again. New faces, younger, ambitious. They bowed deeper, smiled wider, but their words were sharper. They called him, Your Majesty, with too much emphasis, as if reminding themselves whom they were deceiving. I became his shield in ways neither of us had expected. When letters arrived, I read them first. When meetings grew too loud, I spoke instead of him. There were nights I stood behind his chair, one hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath his skin as he kept his voice calm. He didn't ask for my help, but he didn't refuse it either. That was how we existed now, between silence and survival. One evening, I found him in the war room, surrounded by maps. The candles burned low, their wax pooling like melted bone. His hand rested on one map, the northern border, where the rebellion had begun. His fingers pressed over the mark where he had almost died. The sound of the fire was the only thing that moved. When he finally did speak, his voice was quiet, almost detached. He said he'd learned that survival isn't victory, it's debt. That every man who returns from war owes something to the dead he left behind. I understood then what haunted him. It wasn't the battle or even the betrayal. It was the guilt of being the one who lived. I stepped closer, my hand brushing his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the touch, like a man starved for something he couldn't name. I told him he didn't owe the dead, that living was its own kind of penance. He didn't answer. But when I turned to leave, his hand caught mine. Wordless, desperate, human. That was enough. Days blurred again into the rhythm of rebuilding. I began visiting the villages, walking among the people. They didn't know what to call me. Some bowed, some stared, some whispered blessings. I listened more than I spoke. They told me stories, not of the rebellion or the throne, but of hunger, of lost sons, of the price of war that no one in the palace could truly see. I carried those stories back to Dominic. He listened, his eyes heavy but attentive, and made changes, small ones, but real. He lowered taxes on the northern farmlands, opened the royal granaries, sent healers instead of soldiers. For the first time I saw him not as a ruler haunted by duty, but as a man trying to heal his own people as if he could heal himself in the process. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something between us began to soften again. He smiled more. I laughed once, and it startled us both. There were nights we sat by the fire, talking not of politics, but of things neither of us had spoken about before. He told me about the first time he rode a horse as a boy, how he fell and broke his wrist and hid the injury for days out of pride. I told him about the ocean, how I'd once seen it from the cliffs as a child, how I thought it went on forever. He said maybe it did. Sometimes, in the middle of those quiet moments, I'd look at him and wonder how it was possible to love someone like him, a man built of strength and silence, who carried ghosts like armor. But then he'd reach out, brush his thumb over my wrist, and I'd remember that love isn't a question. It's an answer you keep rediscovering. Winter came. The snow fell heavy that year, muting the sounds of the world. The palace seemed smaller under its weight. The windows fogged, the gardens buried. But inside, the fires burned brighter. It was on one of those nights, when the world outside was nothing but white silence, that he told me about the curse. Not in full. He never believed in superstition, but in fragments, in the way men confess without meaning to. He said he'd been marked, not by a witch or a moon, but by his own choices. That power had cost him his peace. I didn't tell him I already knew. I had seen it in him long before he spoke of it. The darkness that lived beneath his calm. The weight of something ancient that pressed against his skin. It wasn't a curse. It was grief, shaped into strength. That night, he fell asleep beside me for the first time since his return. No walls, no armor, no titles. Just breath against breath. Heartbeat against heartbeat. The sound of the wind outside faded, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this was what peace looked like. Not the absence of conflict, but the quiet acceptance that it could return. And you would face it together. Spring arrived sooner than expected. The snow melted, flooding the rivers, feeding the earth. The villages began planting again. The bells from the southern hills rang at dusk, carrying laughter instead of alarms. The kingdom was healing, and so were we. But the scars never disappeared. They became part of the story, reminders of what we had endured. One afternoon, as I walked through the garden, I found him watching me from the balcony. His expression was unreadable, but there was a softness there that hadn't existed before. When I looked up, he said something I barely heard through the wind. I didn't need to. I already knew what he meant. The bond between us wasn't loud. It wasn't built on vows or promises. It was quiet, like the steady rhythm of rain, always there, even when you stopped listening for it. Years later, people would speak of Dominic Everett as the king who rebuilt Ravenwood, the crippled alpha who tamed an empire. They would speak of his wars, his strength, his laws, but they would never know the truth. That his greatest victory wasn't won with armies or weapons, but with something far simpler. The choice to love when love had no reason to survive. As for me, I never wore the crown the way they expected me to. I wore it like a scar, visible, imperfect. But mine, the queen they wrote about in history books, would be described as brave, steadfast, dutiful. But the truth was quieter. I was a woman who had been sold, who had learned to fight, and who had discovered that survival was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Sometimes, when the moon rises full over the hills, I still wake to the sound of the wind in the pines. It sounds like his voice, low, calm, calling me home. And I remember that first night, when I thought the palace was a prison and he was my captor. How wrong I was. The real captivity had been the life I'd lived before, the fear, the silence, the belief that love was something fragile. Dominic taught me that love wasn't fragile at all. It was the strongest thing we had. He passed in spring, the same season he had returned to me. It was quiet, the way he would have wanted it. No ceremony, no speeches. Just him, and me, and the sound of the wind through the open window. He looked at peace. And for the first time I wasn't afraid of what came next. After his death, I continued his work. The kingdom didn't fall apart. It grew. And every time I signed a decree or stood before the people, I felt him there, not as memory, but as presence. In the stillness, in the courage, in the part of me that no longer bent beneath fear. Years later, when I grew old and the world began to blur at the edges, I would still walk to that same balcony, the same wind, the same scent of pine. And every time I would feel it, the quiet pulse beneath my ribs, the unbreakable bond that had outlived everything else. The world calls him king, and me queen. But the truth is simpler. We were just two souls who found each other in the ruins and decided not to let go. And if there is anything beyond this life, anything that waits past the stars, I know he's there, watching, waiting, unyielding as ever. The Wolf who never needed to howl to be heard. When the final night came, I wore the pendant again, the crescent moon that had outlasted kingdoms. It was still warm against my skin. As I closed my eyes, I thought of his voice, of his hands, Of the moment the rain first fell between us. And I smiled. Because love like ours doesn't end. It only changes shape. The fire doesn't die. It becomes the light that guides those who come after. And as the world faded, the last thing I felt was not pain or fear or loss. It was the heartbeat that once found mine in a palace full of silence and never let it go.